Everybody, welcome to the Unit 4 test review for Mr. Parsons' class. Glad to have you all here. Let's jump right into it. So we talked a lot in this unit about the Cold War, how it got started, not quite how it ended up, but we're getting there. Lots of interesting things happened during the Cold War. Let's take a look. How did it begin? Well, mostly the Cold War began with the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, Stalin promised that he would remove his troops from all of the European countries that he had technically liberated, from the Nazis, and that he would hold elections. But he lied. He didn't do it. Instead, he tightened his grip on these countries and made it harder for them to get out from under his control. So what eventually was established was this idea of an Iron Curtain. And in most cases it was fictitious. It wasn't a real curtain, except in the case of the Berlin Wall. That was a real wall that separated things. But it basically this imaginary barrier that separated communist countries from democracy. Communist on one side, democratic on the other. Shortly after World War II, we see the emergence of this NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and this organization still exists today. The main reason why they got together was to defend against Soviet aggression. It was a military alliance, basically. I guess they hadn't learned their lesson from all the other military alliances that got them into World War I and World War II. They decided, well, we need to band together again and try to stop communism from happening. So they were going to defend against Soviet aggression. Some of the original members included the United States, United Kingdom, France, Netherlands, our friendly neighbors to the north, Canada, Italy, and a couple others. Those were the original members. It has since been expanded to include a whole bunch more countries now. NATO is a pretty big world force. So you'll hear a lot about NATO. It got its start right after World War II. The original idea of the original U.S. policy was really to contain communism. It wasn't really to get rid of it necessarily, but mostly just to keep it from spreading, to keep it in Russia, keep it in those communist countries, in the USSR. We didn't want it to spread anywhere else. The communists, on the other hand, of course, wanted to spread it throughout the world. So there became this kind of push and shove match all the time between communist countries and the U.S. and Western countries. George F. Kennan wrote some articles about opposing the expansion of communism. The Truman Doctrine, President Truman decided that he wanted to give military and economic aid to countries who restricted the spread of communism. So this little picture down here, you can see the money train is heading to Greece, and the communist train is about to crash into it. There was a big we dumped a lot of money into Greece to try to get them to persuade them to join our side, to be democratic and Western thinking, as opposed to the communists who were trying to win them over to their side. So we see a lot of military aid, a lot of economic aid going into these countries. One place where it became very interesting was in Berlin. We have this Berlin Wall that's built right down the middle of the city, and the Soviets were blockading Berlin. They weren't allowing Western, the democratic portion of Berlin was completely sealed off. We couldn't get anything into it. So there's this little tiny island of democracy in the middle of all of this communism. And they had shut down the rail lines and shut down all the roads, and so this little democratic enclave was really looking for help, and nobody could get there. Well, we decided roads. We don't need roads. Who needs a stinking road? So we took and used our Air Force to drop supplies into Berlin. There were hundreds and hundreds of planes, sometimes 30 planes landing per day. They would just one after another. A plane would come in and unload, another plane would come in and unload, another plane would come in and unload. It was really amazing to see, and there was really nothing that the Soviets could do to stop it. They weren't about to shoot down some of our planes, otherwise that would have started a war that they weren't ready to get into. So they just had to sit back and watch while we saved these people in the Berlin airlift. So that's kind of what's going on in Europe after World War II. What's happening in Asia? Well, after World War II, you know, most of Japan was pretty well destroyed, and so we left General Douglas MacArthur. I'll talk about him a little bit more in just a second. We left him in charge of Japan. He was one of the forces that helped overthrow it, so we left him in charge. We helped to rebuild Japan in hopes that we were going to gain an ally against communism in Asia. So the real plan was to make them our friends, right? So MacArthur gets a book on the Constitution and writes a new one for Japan in 3 days. Not bad, huh? The original founders took a lot longer than that. Well, MacArthur said, I can do better than that. I'll write it in 3 days. He restructured their education system, and one important thing he did was he made Emperor Hirohito admit that he was not immortal. That was a kind of a big blow to the culture, the Japanese culture. He took pictures like this one here, where he and Emperor Hirohito are pictured together, and you can see from this little picture who's in charge, right? You got short little Emperor Hirohito and this big 6-foot tall military dressed General Douglas MacArthur. It was pretty obvious who was in charge, and MacArthur had these pictures spread throughout the entire country to make everybody understand that it was going to be different from here on out. So MacArthur was the commander of the Pacific Theater in World War II. He commanded all the troops. He had an awesome corncob pipe. I mean, check that thing out. That is a monster. He later, though, was fired by President Truman for insubordination near the end of the Korean War. He wasn't submitting to authority. He kind of got his own idea as to what he should be doing. I think maybe they gave him a little bit too much power in the Pacific, and he didn't want to give it up. So he started out, he liberated, well, maybe not liberated, but he did a lot of good in the Pacific, but ended up getting fired. North Korean War, let's talk about that a little bit. We're still talking about what's going on in Asia. So the North Koreans, who were communist, or at least had communist tendencies, they invaded South Korea, trying to make the entire peninsula into one communist country. After a long back and forth war, the North Koreans made it all the way almost down to the southern tip of South Korea here. They invaded pretty quickly and got pretty far in. Battles got pushed back. The South Koreans pushed all the way up into this area here at one point, and then they decided, well, let's settle on this 38th parallel. We'll call that 38th parallel the line. Everything north is communist, everything south is democratic, and they've established this demilitarized zone. This demilitarized just means that there's no longer any fighting going on there. The war technically is still going on. This North Korean war is technically still in effect, although they signed an armistice, or a cessation of fighting. So they decided just to stop shooting each other. But technically they are still at war. And that's why there's this demilitarized zone, and there's still this really a lot of tension around the 38th parallel there. But yeah, technically the Korean War is still going on. They just decided to stop fighting. Stop shooting anyways. Okay, well, as communism starts to spread throughout the world, people get really scared that it's going to come into the US, and it creates this kind of modern day witch hunt. They were scared that communist sympathizers would try to overthrow our government. Some people who were investigated, Alger Hiss, Ethel Rosenberg, and Whittaker Chambers, they were all suspected of being spies and communist sympathizers. George McCarthy was kind of one of the ones who led the charge against this red menace, and we've coined a term, McCarthyism, the practice of making accusations of disloyalty, subversion, or treason without regard for evidence. Because of this, lots of people felt pressure to conform to avoid suspicion. They needed to make sure that they were nowhere near anything that could be considered communist. It was basically a modern-day witch hunt. Some of you guys have read a little bit about Salem witch trials. It's basically the same thing happening all over again here in the U.S. Talk about good old President Dwight Eisenhower. I like Ike. He was elected shortly after World War II. He was a World War II commander, helped the landing at D-Day, was a very successful general. But as soon as he gets in charge, he starts decreasing the military size. He warned against the building up of the military at his farewell address. He saw exactly what had happened leading up to World War II, this military race, everybody trying to get more and more bigger, better militaries kind of led to a lot of tension. But on the other hand, he also increased the amount of nuclear weapons we held. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there. He talks about, we're going to decrease the size of our military on one hand, but we're also going to increase the amount of nuclear weapons we hold in the other hand. So you can start to see where the policy was more of a nuclear deterrent. We've got enough nukes to keep everybody from doing anything crazy. So the Eisenhower Doctrine became part of his policy. He had committed American aid and troops to protect the Middle East from communism, so protecting countries like Saudi Arabia from becoming communist, committing American aid and troops to help them out. So you can see during this period that the U.S. spends a lot of time trying to help other countries not fall to communism. And we do a number of things during this time period that some people look back on now and wonder if that was really the best idea. We helped put a lot of people in power that were really not that nice to their people, but they were better than, in our eyes, they were better than a communist government. So the Shah of Iran, the CIA helped restore him to power, even though he wasn't really... The Shah in Iran wasn't too bad, but these Guatemalan presidents, and we get involved in Chile and some other countries in Latin America, and we even helped the South Korean dictator stay in power, even though he was kind of a jerk, but we wanted to make sure that communism didn't spread. So even a jerk, a person who was really terrible to his people, as long as he was elected democratically, we were kind of, at the time, we were kind of okay with that. We were kind of promoting that, as long as it wasn't communist. So we got involved in a number of different foreign governments, and it had mixed effect. Most of those countries we got involved in stayed democratic, stayed Western culture-esque. But on the other hand, some people started to wonder why we were messing with things and starting to wonder why we were promoting guys who were kind of jerks to their people. So in a lot of ways, it increased communist sympathy, and throughout the world, anti-American sentiment also began to increase. They didn't really want us messing with everyone else's business. So it was a very interesting time in the world where you got communism pushing on one side, the U.S. and Western thinking pushing on the other, and a lot of tension going back and forth. So what's going on here in the U.S.? We talked a little about the Red Scare, but there was also some great things going on. After World War II, we had money to burn. We had money burning holes in our pockets. Everybody had a little bit of extra money to spend, and they were ready to spend it. They had been rationing for so long that they were tired of living without stuff. So lots of new products get made at this point. Mass manufacturing starts to happen. The price of goods starts to fall. Things like washers and dryers and the great inventions like that. The televisions start to come about, and we start to, Americans, we start to really turn into this consumeristic society at this point. We see the rise of the suburb, people wanting to live near the city so they can find jobs, but not in the city. They want this little American dream of a house with a white picket fence and their own little space to live. So we get developers building these affordable homes inside these massive developments. This is where we really start to see the neighborhood as we know it today, big developments. Levittown, New York was one of the first ones. This is a picture of it there on in the middle. As you can see, these row houses, and row upon row of the same little house, but everybody was pretty happy to have it. It was, again, the American dream. They had just fought this war for freedom, and now they could come home and have a wife and kids and a home and buy all this nice stuff. Consumer spending began to increase. Credit also began to increase. Lots more lending going on. So the economy in the U.S. at least started to really pick up. And because soldiers were home from war and they were happy and life was good, we see a baby boom during the years of, you can see here on the bottom, in the 40s all the way up until the 60s. This rise in, this spike in births happens. It's the baby boom. Those people came home from World War II. Life was good. They were happy. They had a home, so they started to have kids. And they had a lot of them. And a lot of people had a lot of kids. And so we get this baby boom generation, which in our day, right now, our baby boomers are all starting to retire. We have this kind of bubble of human beings that are starting to get old. More old people, or more people entering that upper age bracket now than there are to support them. So it creates some interesting social issues. But anyways, it comes from the baby boom. The Highway Act of 1956 is worth mentioning. It was signed into law by our good friend, President Dwight Eisenhower. It increased the amount of cars per family in the U.S. This really kind of solidified the car as the almost pinnacle of American culture. We love our cars. We love to get out and drive. We love to go places. Our country is huge, and we love the freedom of having our own transportation. So we love cars. It cost $25 billion to build these interstates. It's paid for mostly by a gasoline tax. I don't know if you guys know that, but every time you go to the pump and put gas in your car, you're helping to pay for new roads and maintenance of the roads that are out there. 41,000 miles of interstates, including Interstate 40 that bypassed good old Radiator Springs. Yep, you can thank Dwight Eisenhower for killing Radiator Springs, turning it into a little podunk town off the beaten path. It even leaves the map somewhere. So there goes Route 66 and all that fun. Man, where would we be? We wouldn't have Lightning McQueen or anybody if it wasn't for the highway system, right? Wouldn't have had that great story. Computers. We all love our computers. They were initially built for government, military use. A lot of colleges start to pick up computers and put them in and kind of automate some of their systems, but they were really too large and expensive for personal use in the 50s. You can imagine the first computers that came out. I mean, look at this guy. It's as big as the room. It's monstrous. Something interesting to notice, though, is that you, right now, have more technology in your cell phone than the first astronauts took to space. They jumped in this capsule that had nothing but wires and toggle switches. There was a very limited computer power in that capsule that they rode all the way to the moon. You have more technology, more computer power built into your phone than the astronauts took to space. It's pretty amazing, huh? So be careful what you do with it. Television starts to really shape and affect society during the 50s. Television becomes much more prevalent thanks to good old Philo Farnsworth. Way to go, Idaho. Helped invent the television, and it becomes very, very popular, very integrated into common culture. Most people in the 50s would eat dinner and sit down and watch TV together as a family. Sometimes, one or two people on the whole street had a TV, so it became a neighborhood affair. Everybody would come over to the Joneses and watch TV for an hour or two, so the house was always full of people until everybody else could start affording their own TV. Interesting thing culture-wise, though, because most TV shows originated in the U.S., U.S. culture begins to spread throughout the world. So Coca-Cola, Levi's jeans, drifters, just stuff like that starts to really Happy Days, those kind of things. Those kind of things start to be spread throughout the world, and it becomes this melding of Western culture throughout the world, thanks to the spread of TV and the fact that most TV shows originated from the U.S. at the time. It was also a great place to get news and entertainment. We started to become much more informed as a people because we started to have the TV to watch. Not only could we, up until this point we had radio programs which could tell us a lot, but now that we can see it, see the suffering in other countries, we can see the programs that are put on the TV, it becomes much more beneficial to us, I guess. Kind of brings it home. During this time period following World War II, as kind of a reaction to what happened in Europe, we started to see the sort of distortion of religion with the Nazis and the tearing down of religion with the communists. There's a resurgence of religion in America. We start to do things like we added the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance during this time period. That's an important change in our culture. We adopted the national motto of "In God We Trust," and the media, the TV, starts to show evangelical TV programs where people are getting on TV and praying and doing things like that. We really start to see this upsurgence during this time period. A lot of it, like I said, was a reaction to what we saw in some of the horrors that people witnessed over in World War II in the name of, and sometimes in spite of, religion. So we start to kind of reassert what we believe as an American people, or at the time what they believed. One other important aspect of culture during the 1950s, we talked about the Red Scare and how people were trying to conform. Lots of conformity. Conformity was kind of the name of the game in the 50s. And this particular book, The Organization Man, was written as a reaction to that by William H. White. It became a bestseller, one of the best books ever written on management. But the idea was that these bureaucracies where people started to go to work for these big companies, and everybody had their own little cubicle, and everybody needed to dress the same, and everybody needed to act the same, and it made these workers incapable of independent thought. They became part of the machinery of this factory of a business, this big conformist idea. And so this book was written to kind of help people break out of that. As a reaction to that, people start to go, wait a minute, I don't want to be a faceless member of this cog in this machine. I don't want my own little tiny cubicle. It looks like everybody else's. I want to be independent. And so there's a lot of that. That goes to the extreme in the 60s, as we'll start to see later. We get our hippies and our extreme independence and things like that as a reaction to what started to go on in the 50s. Let's talk about a couple of leaders. Good old John F. Kennedy, one of our very popular presidents. He was a Catholic, and so far he's the only non-Protestant religion president that we've ever had. So that's an interesting little tidbit about John F. Kennedy. He was the only Catholic, only non-Protestant that's ever been elected president. The Nixon-Kennedy debates were one of the first televised presidential debates. People who watched it, interestingly enough, most people who watched it thought Kennedy had won. Nixon at the time was sick. He had the flu. He looked terrible. He was sweating all the time on TV, and he really, those of you guys who have seen pictures of Nixon, he wasn't really that attractive of a man in the first place, so it didn't really make him look good on TV. So people who watched the debate on TV thought that Kennedy had won. They thought that Nixon was fumbling and sweating the whole time and just really not comfortable. Those people who listened to it on the radio, though, thought Nixon had won. They believed his answers were better than what came across the radio as far as Kennedy's answers. So it's a very interesting study to look at the influence of TV and the visual aspect of our presidential campaigns nowadays. We don't get many people who are elected president who aren't, good-looking dudes. And it really started to happen during this time period that these things start to get televised. Okay? Up until this point, we had some presidents who, let's face it, they weren't exactly the cream of the crop as far as looks go. But from here on out, Kennedy on out, our presidents start to get quite a bit more physically attractive, something like that. So it's hard nowadays to get elected president if you're not an attractive dude. We'll say that. Kennedy was a really good speaker, and he was really good at getting, especially the young people, involved in America. He said things like the quote there, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." Definitely inspired younger people to get involved and work for the country there. Kennedy got this started, and Johnson kind of had to pick up the slack. Well, not slack. Had to pick up the torch and run with it after Kennedy was assassinated. But the civil rights movement of the late 50s and 60s, we've talked about this quite a bit, so I'll let this stand as is. But after World War II, there were lots of Jim Crow laws which had prevented African Americans from being able to participate daily. Freedom rides. The Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas was one of the first integrated schools. The March from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. The nonviolent marches, riots that did get violence. Look up some advocates of civil rights. You need to know a little bit about Thurgood Marshall, James Meredith, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, Bobby Seale. All these guys worked hard to try to help people gain equal rights, African Americans. Some of them were more militant than others. Of course, Malcolm X was a lot more violent than others, a lot more violent than Martin Luther King, who advocated for direct, nonviolent action. He was a student of Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent aggression, nonviolent resistance. And we all know a lot about Martin Luther King Jr., so be prepared to answer some questions about him on a test. So here's some of the major acts that come out of the Civil Rights period. The Act of 1964 eliminated segregation in public accommodations. 65 eliminates discrimination in voting, and we get a Supreme Court ruling, the Brown versus the Board of Education, ruled that separate but equal is it ruled that separate is inherently unequal. Said that just by the nature of keeping things segregated, it means that they're not equal. So now schools have to be integrated, all the public places have to be integrated. There can be no more whites restrooms and blacks restrooms for African Americans and things like that. So thanks to the Brown Board versus the Board of Education, it's ruled that those things are unconstitutional. So we start to see an end to a lot of the Jim Crow laws in the 1960s. And here's one of the last leaders we're going to talk about, good old Lyndon Baines Johnson. He, of course, took over after Kennedy was assassinated and then was reelected later. He came up with this, he and his Congress and his cabinet came up with the idea of this great society. At the time, there were a lot of people asking for social reforms, a lot of people asking for civil rights reforms and things like education reforms, and a lot of people were asking for help from the federal government. So they established this U.S. Department of Education during this time period, starting programs like Head Start, which is a preschool for less advantaged people with lower economic status. Medicaid and Medicare are signed into law during Lyndon Johnson's presidency. This great society idea of everybody being cared for was really important to these people at this time period. We see Medicaid, Medicare still affect us today. A lot of people are still benefiting from these type of programs, and but there's a lot of people starting to attack these type of programs today as well. So we'll see what the future of these programs and the great society that President Johnson and his cabinet and his Congress set up are. That's it for your Unit 4 test. Good luck on it. You guys are going to do great.